Welcome everyone to Unlocking the Power of Your Data, working with databases in FME. So I will hand things over to our presenters to introduce themselves. So starting with Dan.
Hey, my name's Dan. I'm a technical support specialist here at Safe Software. I work on the FME desktop side of things, helping new users getting started with FME. And yeah, excited to present this webinar today.
Awesome.
And hi, my name is Matt. I'm also a technical support specialist, but on the FME server team. So yeah, working with customers to resolve issues and doing webinars and contributing to our community and knowledge base.
Excellent. Thanks both. All right, before we hop in, if this is your first time in Livestorm, here's just a few pointers. Click the help button on the bottom left for 4 simple steps if you do have any audio or video issues. Click the react button. You're all using it right now. That's great to see. So share your reactions with us during the webinar. And then we have the questions and chat tabs. So drop any questions that you might have for Dan and Matt as we go in there. We also have Mark, Nampreet, and Steve joining us on the back end here. So they will be available to help answer questions as well. And then the chat, keep letting us know where you're tuning in from. We also have a polls tab, and we'll be seeing a couple polls come up briefly in a moment here. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. All right, and if you would like to download the slides and follow along live with us, you can do that by clicking the top right button on the deck there. And I will hand things back over to Matt to go through our agenda.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, so welcome all. We're gonna just go through a quick introduction, and then Dan's gonna present FME and database connectivity. We'll talk about connections and how FME can connect to different databases. Then we'll get into some more demos, working with databases in FME, data extraction and transformation demo that's gonna focus on SQL and different patterns for loading and writing data with SQL. Finish off with some data loading and synchronization. That'll touch on server a little bit. And finally, some tips and best practices and QA and closing remarks, so long as we stay on track, and we'll have time for that at the end. So yeah, we'll start with a quick poll. Elizabeth, do you want to get folks started?
So I'll go ahead. I've published that now, so you should see that appear in your polls tab on the bottom right. So you can select multiple options there, folks, if you do use more than one relational database. And we'll keep an eye out for the submissions. All right. Dan and Matt, does that look about what you would be to expect there?
Yeah, lots of SQL Server.
Lots of Esri Enterprise Geodatabase users, Oracle, Postgres, PostgreSQL.
Yeah.
A couple other ones there, which is interesting to see. We've got SQLite, MySQL.
I'm afraid to check the other and see who's using Access. I won't click it. Not to access, shame.
It does look like we have others being chatted in the chat as well. So that's interesting to see. Thanks, everyone. At this point, I'll get our presenters to turn off the webcams for the remainder, just to save on some bandwidth. And we can move on to the next slide here.
Great, yeah, that's really interesting to see those results. More people using Postgres and PostgreSQL. So about integration, integration gets your data to the people and processes that need it. It can take a lot of data from many systems to understand that bigger picture and enable better decision making. So we're just going to kick things off and do a quick flash demo here. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me for one moment. Okay, and hopefully we're all seeing that. So this is FME Workbench. We're going to spend a lot of time in here during the webinar. Many of you probably already seen this, but this is our visual canvas for building our data transformations. And in this use case, we're just going to do a quick data translation where we're going to take some water meter data that's in JSON and some residential lot data that's in a Postgres database. Do a little bit of attribute validation, make sure our meters aren't missing account numbers or meter IDs, join these two disparate data sets together in FME and write them out to SQL Server. So this workspace was built in a couple minutes, and we'll run it. And with caching turned on, we can see features flowing. We can inspect our caches. We'll see that a couple features have failed validation. Looks like we're maybe missing an account number and a meter ID here. And we've written out all the valid ones, 1531, to our SQL Server database, just like that. So that's just a quick flash demo to get us started. And I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to spend a lot more time in FME, of course, over the course of the webinar. So challenges with our data, it's messy. A lot of organizations just don't end up using their data because it's too frustrating or confusing to work with. Organizations have a lot of complex application ecosystems, different databases and format. Data needs to arrive in one format, go out in another, needs to be validated and enriched. And so if this is you, you've come to the right place. FME can definitely help you with those problems. So we can help unlock and integrate your data, break down all those data silos, surface that hard to reach data, make it more accessible, create simple no-code solutions for integrating your data that everyone can help maintain because it's a visual solution, and automate your integrations. And our big strength is we bring the power of spatial data to your decision making, but we do work with and support all kinds of different data sets, not just spatial. So just a quick overview of SAFE. Over almost 30 years in the business. This might be over 30 now, depending on how up to date this is. Yeah, over 16,000 organizations using us worldwide. Many countries. We have a large partner network to help deliver FME services. And a very active FME community. If you have any questions, you can hop in there and feel free to ask and reach out to the community. A high-level overview of our platform. So FME Desktop, that's what we just saw. That's where you're going to author your workflows. You can publish those to FME Server, where they can be automated to, for example, run nightly in off hours. FME Cloud is our software as a service solution, so FME Server hosted in the cloud, and we also have FME Mobile. And so we've been around for a long time, as I say, and we're always adding new data formats. This is just a quick kind of overview showing how we've evolved over the years to support different data formats. For example, in upcoming FME Server or FME 2023, we're going to have readers and writers for the Databricks format. So if you're using that one, it's just an example of a new data type that we're adding. And we're always adding new ones. So I'll pass it off to Dan now to talk about database connectivity.
All right, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so I quickly just wanted to give an overview of FME's database support. It's going to include different types of databases and your connectivity options. And then I'm going to show you how you can connect to a database using FME and how you can manage those connections. So with your database formats, you'll be required to connect and authenticate to your database services in order to use them. So for example, with the Microsoft SQL Server non-spatial reader, you'll need to provide a server name, database name, as well as your authentication type and more. When you're connecting to an SDE, it's important to know when you're doing that, you need your SDE connection file to connect instead of a FME database connection. So that's one of the gotchas there. That one's a little bit different, but if you're connecting to your SDE, you probably already have that connection file, so that makes it even easier for you. So let's go into our database connection. So as you can see, we've got our example here. When you go into add a reader, you're going to get prompted to add a database connection, or you can connect with an existing connection. So our goal is to just understand how to manage your database connections and how they're stored in FME Desktop. The obstacle is maybe you don't know where they exist. Maybe you've created some and you don't know where to manage them or to import and export them. And we're going to do this using the FME options window. And your result will be easy to manage database connections that can be added, edited, and more. So let's go to our demo. As you can see, when we go into add a reader for our format, if we type in a format here for SQL Server, you're going to be prompted for a database connection. And this is where you can add that database connection. You'll give it a name. One thing to take note of here is that you probably want to give it a unique name that's also memorable, something that means something to you, whether that's the name of your database you're connecting to, or just a good way to keep organized. You can also give it your server name, database name, and then you have options for authentication, as well as providing your username and password. If you want to manage your database connections, then you can go up here into Tools, go to FME Options, and we'll go down to our database connections. And you'll have an overview of all your different connections. You can right-click on one of your connections, and you have options to edit the parameters. You can retest that connection, make sure it works. You can duplicate it, or you can import and export it. These are both useful tools if you want to, maybe share your database connections with another employee or a coworker at your company. And from here, you can also remove and add new database connections. So you have your whole list of connections that you can use here. So I'll just cancel all this window. I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll go back to the slides. So just a couple tips are to use clear and consistent naming conventions. As I mentioned, this will just make it a lot easier in the future when you're choosing which database to connect to. Your connections are going to be different depending on your format. As you can see in the screenshot here, it looks a little bit different than the SQL Server database connection. So that's just something to be careful of. And some formats are going to require dependencies. So if you are working with certain formats, for example, Oracle will require an Oracle client to be installed in order for the reader and writer to work. That's just something to keep note of. All right, I'll pass it back off to you, Matt.
Awesome, thanks, Dan. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll look at another demo of working with databases in FME. Okay, so yeah, back in FME Workbench. This is a workspace that's been built up on the Flash demo we saw earlier. So in our Flash demo, if you recall, we were joining together some water meter data in JSON and some residential lot data in a Postgres database. We're going to expand on this and bring in some Excel and CSV data as well, so we can enrich our data with the zone descriptions and the addresses. And the goal here is to write everything out to SQL Server still, so that everything can be in one table to be more easily consumed by, for example, a BI tool. So just expanding on our data validation, we have a powerful transformer called the attribute validator that we saw in the Flash demo. It's going to do continue to do our validation, but in this case, anything that fails, it's going to write it out to an Excel report. So those failed account numbers or missing meter IDs will capture those on one sheet in Excel. Any invalid addresses will capture on another sheet. And we'll do some more joining. First, we'll join our water meters to our zones as we did before, or to our lots. And then we're going to get our zone descriptions in and our address data. Now, this is one way to join, especially if you're new to FME. It's a simple way to do it, but we also have a powerful transformer called the inline querier. I could write all this data out to a temporary SQLite database using this inline querier, and then use SQL to join it together as well. And finally, we're going to write out to our water meter table again in SQL Server. So I'm going to run this. Oh, what has been incompleted? Sorry, I just ran this one. Oh, it's because I've got the inline query on the canvas. I just wanted to talk about that one. Okay, I'll run it now. Okay, and just like that, yeah, we've written out our water meters to SQL. We've got 70 invalid meters where there's no address found for the meter ID. So we've got those written out to our Excel exception report. Another approach you can take here, so with our writers, once you've written out to a database. It's kind of like the end of the workflow. But oftentimes we need to take action after we've written our data. So I'm going to just show you another way to something called a feature writer. So this will still write, this feature writer still writes to SQL Server and many of the other database formats we support. But it gives us the option of continuing our workflow after the data has been written. So this lets you do some SQL post-processing. For example, here I've got an SQL executor, and I'm going to go create an index on my table, clustered index, to just make accessing the data a little bit quicker. So now I'll run this. And the feature writer will still write our data out, workflow will continue and create our index for us. So I'll stop sharing my screen, get back to the slides here. And sorry, I forgot to go through this intro slide. This was supposed to be before the demo, but it was just summarizing what we just looked at. And to summarize some tips and tricks, you can use attribute validators to validate incoming data before proceeding. Output records that fail validation, you can put them into an error report for review. And we have other transformers like emailers and stuff if you want to send those reports out. Feature joiners let you join disparate data sets as long as you have a common key. And feature writers allow your workflow to proceed after the data has been written. And back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Matt. Awesome. So we're going to take a look at data extraction and transformation and how you can use FME to accelerate your workflows, extract that data from your databases, and transform it. So the goal here with the following demos is going to be looking at how we can improve the performance of our data extraction and transformation workflows. So our obstacle is that reading and filtering and FME is taking a lot of processing power and time due to the constantly growing size of your database and your tables. And our solution here is going to be utilizing database capabilities in FME, such as views, indexes, where clauses, and more. The result is performant workspaces that let the database do the work instead of FME. And that's really going to be the focus of these next couple of demonstrations, is that we're going to be leveraging the database alongside FME to get the most out of both of our processing power. So we have the power of the database alongside the power of wherever FME desktop is running. So we'll take a quick look at our demo. I'll just share my screen. So on here, in our first bookmark, this is our first example, and this is going to be kind of the standard, you know, that you're reading in your full data set. We've got 140,000 features, and then we're using a tester to filter out all of our features. What we're going to be doing throughout these workflows is we have a data set of world cities. In this world cities data set, we have information such as the name of the city, which country the city belongs to, which is dictated by the country code here. And we have other information here we can work with, such as population and more. So in our tester here, we've set our test to check if the country code equals CA. So we're going to be checking for cities that fall within Canada. And if we were to run this whole workspace at once, it would take around 14 seconds to complete running. Now, obviously, that's not a lot of time just for this workflow, but you know, if you had millions of features that you're trying to filter through, it's not very efficient to read in all of those features when all we want to do is read in, you know, a tenth of or even less of our features. So we're only ending up with 1,206 features. Then we started out with 140,000. But you know, what if we could just read in those 1,200 features to start instead of going all the way in, reading in all those features, and then having to store them in temporary memory and then filter them out? Well, with FME, you can use different types of features on your databases to filter out your data before you actually read it in. And probably the easiest way to do this is going to be using a where clause. In our database reader feature type here, we can go into our settings. And we've told it that we want to read in features where the country code equals CA. So this is only going to be reading in those features where the country code equals CA, and we're going to get a similar result as our tester above. But this time, when I run this, you can see it'll run in a second or so. It's going to read in all those features, and it's reading in the exact same data. We're ending up with the exact same amount of data, but we're saving lots of time. The next way you could do this, and this is going to be performing a similar action, is we're going to be using a database view. So you might want to use a database view when you're going to be reading in or performing the same query lots and lots of times. So if we were to use this where clause, where we're looking for country code equals CA, if we're going to use this through a lot of different workspaces or continuously through our workspace, then we might as well use a view. And a view allows you to create a virtual table within your database that is created from a SQL query. In this case, our query is to create a view, and we're selecting all of our features from our world cities table where our country code equals CA. So in our SQL Creator here, which is a great tool for working with SQL, if you're familiar with it, or if you want to keep learning more, we have lots of content on our knowledge base too. You can go in here and set which database you want to connect to. You can see I've selected our database webinar connection. And in our SQL statement, what you can see here is, and I'll zoom in for you, is we're creating a view called v_cities_ca. And we're selecting all of our columns from our table called world cities. And we're using that same where clause we saw in the other database reader feature type. If we run this, it'll create that view. And what you'll see is when that view already exists. So that's probably why we're getting the rejected. But if we go into our table here and we read this in, so that's just something to be careful of when you're working with SQL. You might already have existing views or indexes, so just something to keep an eye on when you're using the SQL Creator or SQL Executor. And we can take a look at our v_cities_ca, and this is our view of our database table. But in this case, we're only reading in those 1,200 features that fall under our where clause. So as you can see, all of our country codes are CA, and this is what we were looking for. And this would just make it really easy to reuse this specific view throughout many different workflows. Next, we have our SQL Creator and SQL Executor. So I just showed you the SQL Creator to create a view. And again, the SQL Creator is going to be useful if you're familiar with SQL. You want to go in and perform a specific query. In this one, you can see we're just selecting all our columns from that world cities table, and we're performing that same where clause. We've also specified the attributes we want to expose, and when we run this, it'll read in all of those attributes from that table. So you can see we have those 12,000 features, and again, we're reading in the same amount of features. Now the SQL Executor is a little bit different because with the SQL Creator, this is initializing the workflow, whereas the SQL Creator takes in an initiator. So you could feed it in information coming from other attributes and create more dynamic queries. Maybe you have a where clause coming from somewhere else. Maybe you have a database that you're pulling information from, and you can work that into your SQL Executor. And again, this is just doing the same thing. So if I go in here, we have the same clause set up. We're just selecting all those columns and performing that where clause. This will function the same way as the SQL Creator, but the advantage with this is that you're just able to work with your data before the SQL Creator and also after. Next, we have our indexes. And indexes are really useful for querying your data. So when we're using our SQL Executor, we're able to create an index on our table after we've created it. And the transform that really allows us to come to life is that feature writer. If you had a standard writer in your workflow, that is where your workflow would end. You wouldn't be able to work with your data after that. But with our feature writer, we're able to continue working with our data, and we'll be able to create that index. So to start, we're reading in that world cities data set. We've got our feature writer here. And if you're not familiar with the feature writer, this is very similar to any other writer, but in here, you'll just set your format, where you want to output your data to, and we're creating a table called world cities underscore indexed. If I run this, we'll create that table. And it'll write that out to our Postgres database. And in our SQL executor, we can now create an index on that table. So as you can see, when we're creating the index, we assign it a name. So we're just calling it index1. You might want to give it a more meaningful name. And we're creating this on our table we just created, which is the world cities underscore index table. And we're choosing which columns we want to create that index on. One thing to note here is also with the SQL creator and SQL executor, if you are reading from a data set that already has an index on it, what you could do to speed up your workflow is you could drop that index before you read your data, read in that data, maybe write it out to some destination or write it back out to the same destination, and then you can create that index again. So you can see we've written out and created that index, and everything looks good there. Next, we're just going to take a look at some spatially enabled filtering. The first one here is quite simple. We're going to be performing a search envelope, and this is a parameter you can find on your reader in the navigator window here. So if I click our drop-down arrow, you can see we have a search envelope here, and I've specified our search envelope of where we want to filter our data spatially. So the way you can think of this is we like to use the cookie cutter analogy where say you have your contents on a map and you use a cookie cutter to cut out only the contents you want. In this case with the search envelope, it's going to be a box or rectangular shape since you're setting the bottom left corner of your box and the top right corner of your box. But later on, I'll show you how you can use different shapes and polygons and existing data sets to filter your data spatially. One key thing to highlight here, and I don't want to go too in depth into this, is that you just want to be careful about your coordinate systems. If you do have a coordinate system on your data set, you'll want to assign that. You can see we have that assigned here. And we also have our coordinate system for our search envelope. So you can see when I read in our data, and we'll let this run. We'll grab those 90 features. And if I go into our spatial view here, you can see that we have these features that fall within our bounding box. We have all these features on the west coast of Canada. And to give an example, the bounding box kind of fit into a shape like this. We just specified those coordinates, and those are the results that we were given back. Now, if you wanted to get more specific with your spatial queries, you can use a feature reader. And again, with the feature reader, we are able to perform a little more functions on our data, same with the feature writer. In this case, I'm reading in a shapefile of the boundaries of Canada. So I'll give you a preview of this data set. So we've just got a data set of the country boundaries. And what we want to do is we want to find all the features that fall within those country boundaries and only read those in. So in our feature reader, we've selected that world cities data set. And in here, we've set a spatial filter. And in here, we've just said we want all those results that intersect that incoming data set. So all the world cities that we're reading in, we're only going to get the ones that fall within those country boundaries. So when I read this, going to see that we'll read in all of those features. and they fall within our country boundaries. And as you can see on our data set here, we have only the cities that fall within Canada. All right, we'll go back to our slides. So some key takeaways here. Well, the first thing we notice is that FME, it's an effective tool for filtering data, and it can still work pretty quickly. But if we can lean on our database, we're going to be improving our performance by significant amounts. As you can see, using those where clauses, creating views, using indexes, we're really going to be able to improve the performance of our workflows. And when you're reading in less data, that means you're going to be using less, you have less data to work with down throughout your workflow. So downstream, you've already filtered out that data. You're not taking up temporary memory, and that means you have more space for other performance. SQL is a powerful tool when used alongside FME. And when you let the database do the work, you can save time and resources. There are various ways to let your database do the work, as we saw. With where clauses, you'll want to filter out that data before reading it in. And in the example that we were showing, we only wanted to read in the cities that were within Canada. So the equivalent in FME of just doing a pure FME approach instead of using the database alongside it would be to use that tester. But in that case, you're reading in all those features to start. Views are a useful tool for creating those virtual tables based on the result of a SQL statement. And you would want to use this if you know you're going to be reusing the same where clause or the same SQL statement in a lot of your workflows. And for example, you're always using that same where clause, so you want to just create a view, and it makes it a lot easier when you're reading that table in. Indexes can also speed up your workflows when reading in data. And an index is, it's used to retrieve that data from the database more quickly than if you didn't have an index. And one thing to be careful of is that it can slow down your workspaces when you're writing, depending on your index, because the database has to write the index for each feature. But as we demonstrated, you can create that index after writing out your data set, but you can also drop it before writing out your data set. With our search envelope and spatial filtering, we're able to narrow down our search to a bounding box or use an existing data set to clip our data to those data set boundaries. In this case, we were looking at the country borders for Canada. All right, Matt, I'll pass it back off to you.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, some really interesting and useful SQL tips there. So I would like to talk a little more about data loading and synchronizing our data. So the goal here is to keep the database up to date when changes happen upstream. Some of our obstacles are syncing data is either a manual effort or requires coding a solution. And the solution we can offer is FME's change detector transformer, which will detect changes between two data sets, and we'll schedule that to run in an FME server automation, resulting in data that's refreshed on schedule. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, so back in Workbench, first thing we'll do is add our source data set. So this is a Postgres database of fake patient records. It's all just fake data. And this is the Postgres database we want to keep up to date when our upstream database, which is a SQL Server database, is updated. So these are our existing records in Postgres. And SQL Server has the most up-to-date data, so we want to sync this one. First thing we'll want to do is all of our column names in Postgres are lowercase, which is kind of a Postgres standard. SQL Server is uppercase columns in this case. So I'm going to use something called a bulk attribute renamer to change the case of all my column names to uppercase so that the change detector can compare more easily. So here's our change detector. So we've got our original Postgres database coming in and our revised records from SQL Server. And this is a pretty powerful transformer. In this case, we're just looking for changes on the ID attribute. So, and this is uppercase in SQL Server, and that's why we made it uppercase coming from Postgres as well to make that comparison. So any new IDs that are made are inserted into SQL Server are going to be detected and come out this inserted port in our change detector, so we can insert them into Postgres. But this transformer can do a whole lot more. You can detect changes in specific attributes or columns within your data set. You can also look for geometry changes within features in your data sets. So there's our change detector. The next thing we'll do is some date-time conversion. So we're just going to clean up some of the data or reformat some of the times coming in from SQL Server before writing to Postgres. We'll do some null attribute mapping. So any null attributes we want to set to a value before writing them to Postgres. And finally, an attribute remover, which is just cleaning up the columns in our schema before writing them back to Postgres. Sort the data. And finally, we'll have this is our Postgres database, the same one that we're reading in over here. We're going to update it with any changes from SQL Server. So I'm going to run this. We'll see we've got 41,114 records that have come in from our SQL Server database, but only 41,094 in Postgres. So our change detector has detected that 20 new records have been inserted to SQL Server. And so we're going to work with those 20, make sure that the date is in the right format, any null attributes are mapped, clean up our schema, and write those 20 out to Postgres. And just to hop into the database itself, this is what our table looked like before, or I did a query anyways to look at any IDs greater than ID 4,975, and we see that the IDs ended at 4,980. If I run this query again, we'll see that we have 20 new records that have been inserted. So our downstream Postgres database has been kept up to date. But I don't really want to do this manually all the time. I'd rather this happen while I was sleeping in off hours. So for that, we can use our other product, FME Server. So I'm going to publish this workspace up to an FME Server instance I have. And we'll see I've actually already published it, so I'll just change the name on this. When publishing to FME Server, I'll get prompted to publish any database connections I need. I know that these are already up there, so I'm going to leave them unchecked. And I can register it to services. So FME Server has a few different ways that it can work with workspaces but we won't get too in-depth in this. If you want to learn more, we have lots of information in the community and other webinars you can watch on FME Server. So that's been published, that workspace. I've already built the automation, so I'm just going to bring up a tab here and go into FME Server. So I've already built this automation, and it's running at the moment. So what FME Server lets you do is take your workspaces, like this change detection one we just looked at, and trigger them. In this case, we're using a schedule trigger that's just running daily. every night at 10 o'clock. And it's going to run that change detection workflow for us and email us if there's any errors. So some tips and tricks, takeaways from that. Let the change detector do the hard work. FME server automations can run your data synchronization on schedule. And automations can also be event-driven to synchronize your data in near real time. So for example, you might have a web application like Survey123, and that can fire up something called the webhook that can trigger an automation in FME server to keep data in sync in real time or near real time. And we have another webinar on that if you're interested, and you can find that in the FME community. And Dan, I'll give it back to you to talk about some tips and best practices.
Great, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so to finish off here, before we go into some Q&A, we're going to be looking at some tips and best practices when working with databases in FME. And as I was mentioning earlier there, when you're working with your database connections, you want to make sure you give them meaningful names, just so you don't add to any confusion. If you have lots of different databases or that you're working with, then you want to make sure those have names that make some sense to you. Just a good practice there. We also want to caution around changing passwords. When password changes are made in your database, these won't be reflected in your database connection. So just something to be careful of. If you are making changes or you find that your database connection no longer works, it's probably because your authentication or credentials are not valid anymore. We also want to always let the database do the work. We only want to read in those features that we need, and we want to leverage the knowledge of our SQL queries to be able to filter out our data before we actually read it in. As I mentioned before, we have quite a few articles on this, and we'll be sharing these out as we reach our resources slide. We also want to pay close attention to case sensitivity when we're working with certain databases. For example, Oracle is going to be using uppercase for the attribute names, whereas Postgres is going to be using a lowercase for your attribute names. So something to just be careful of. FME does a really good job, though, of connecting up those attributes if you are working between different databases with different requirements such as that. But it's just something to be mindful of if you are running into any trouble. We also recommend having one reader and writer per database. So as you saw throughout my workflows, I had those readers multiple times in our workspace. But if that was just an example workflow, but if I was to have a proper workflow that we know we're going to be running multiple times, and we want to be the most efficient, well, we would only want to read in those features once with one reader, and we would only want to write them out once with one writer as well. That way, we're going to be saving time and performance power, and that's going to help us in the long run. We also have the replace connection functionality. So this makes it easy to swap out old connections for new ones. And I'll show this in a demo in a second. But this is really useful if you find that you're using a database connection through multiple transformers or readers and writers, and you just want to replace that one connection throughout every single one of those transformers and readers and writers. You also need to be careful of schema names. FME is going to be writing to the default schema, but you have the ability to set the table qualifier parameter if you want to write to a specific schema and table. You can consider using the inline querier if you want to perform multiple joins on your data sets. Instead of using a feature joiner, it's really up to you which one you prefer, but that is another tool that you can use there. We have our SQL statement tool in FME, and this is really useful for avoiding syntax errors. And again, I'll show you this in a second. You can find this in your SQL creators or your SQL executors. And yeah, feature joiners are going to let you join disparate data sets. So as I mentioned before, you can also use the inline querier if you want to get more in depth with your joins. So we'll take a look at a demo of some tips and tricks. So the first one we're going to be looking at here is how you can auto connect your attributes. Now, typically FME does a really good job, as I mentioned, of connecting up these attributes. But in this case, we're working with a SQL Server reader, or shall I say SQL Server reader, and then we also have our Oracle writer. Now, in this case, we have a bit of a disconnect between the case of our attribute names. For our SQL Server, we have title case, whereas with our Oracle, we have all uppercase. Now, instead of having to go through here and drag and drop like this, I can actually just right-click on our connection and click Auto Connect. And if you find you're having this issue throughout any of your workflows and you just want to connect up those attributes quickly, that's one quick way to do it. As we mentioned before, you want to offload your work to the database where possible. In this case, you could do where clauses, or here I'm just performing a SQL statement where I'm reading in those first names that begin with a J. So if I read in this data set, we're only going to read in those rows where the first name begins with J, and it's just a really quick way to filter your data. You're not just restricted to those where clauses. There's a lot more you can work with SQL. So as you can see, we've got those attributes that only begin with a J. On your writer, you can also set your schema name that you want to write to. So if you're writing to a schema other than the default one, you can click on your writer feature type, and in here, you can assign the table qualifier. So it's just something to be aware of if you are looking to do so, and it can be a really useful tip and trick. The last thing I wanted to highlight here was our what I like to call the SQL statement tool. When you're in your SQL creator and you want to create a statement, when I go in here, depending on the database that you're working with, there might be a little bit of syntax required to correctly create your SQL statements. Now, if I wasn't familiar with SQL, or if I haven't worked with it for a while, as has happened to me before, I'll go in here, and instead of having to actually kind of try and mess around with this and try to get this to work, I can just go in here, type out my statement, and on the left here, we can actually go to our database tables. It's going to query our database, show me what tables are available. I can double click on it, and it's going to fill out any of that syntax. In this case, we're using square brackets. And if I want to perform a where clause on a specific column, I can click the drop-down arrow, and I'll double click on that. And then we're able to just fill out our statement as is. So that just makes it really handy. Different databases are going to require different syntax. If you're using another database, it might require you to use double quotes instead of brackets. So if you do have issues with your SQL failing, maybe you're not able to read in those features and you don't really get any information from the translation log, then this is something to check and is a really useful tool. All right, so that's it for our tips and tricks section. Hopefully some of those are helpful and you find useful in your future workspaces. If you do have any tips and tricks for us, let us know. We're always interested in hearing them. There's always more that we can add. So yeah, we'll head on to some a summary and some resources just to finish things off. So we want to remember that we don't want to waste the value of our data by keeping it stuck. Some of the things that can happen, your data is sitting in different places. We're not really getting the full value out of our data, but with FME, we're able to connect with these databases, and it makes it really easy with our readers and writers. We have support for hundreds of formats, and when we pair that with our different transformers and our SQL, we're really able to power up those workspaces. And we also wanted to know, before we finish off here, we wanted to know what type of non-relational databases you're using right now. So I think Elizabeth has started the poll down there. So we just want to see. These are a little bit more niche or different from the relational databases. So it'll be interesting to see what the results are.
Yeah, and this is a bit of a sneak peek of some content that could be to come in a future webinar this year. So definitely make sure to cast your answers there, and that'll help shape our webinar coming up later this year.
For sure. Looks like a lot of folks so far are still very focused on relational databases, which makes sense, especially in the spatial world. But we see Mongo and Snowflake pretty high up there too.
Got a few Databricks users, which is cool to see since we have some Databricks stuff coming up.
Excellent.
Definitely.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, so we have some resources here. We've got our working with databases and data warehouses and FME article. This is really useful. It's kind of your catch-all article. We'll have lots of information in there on different databases and how to work with them, and a couple examples as well. So if you're just getting started or you want to learn more about databases and FME, that's a good place to go. We also have our database tips and tricks in FME. So some of the tips and tricks I showed you today, you'll find in that article, and we'll share these out in the chat for you as well, so you can get your hand on these. And yeah, the database tips and tricks article is really useful. We also have our let the database do the work tutorial. So that'll really go into a lot of those examples where you're leveraging SQL queries to speed up your workflows. And then we also have our merging or joining spatial data article, which is really great if you're looking to venture into that realm of things. All right, yeah, and feel free to contact us. We would love to talk to anybody who has questions or is interested about anything to do with data or what we can do for them. You can email us at info@safe.com. If you're interested, we have our free trial. If you're new to FME and you want to kind of play around with things and just get started, our free trial is the full-fledged FME, so you have access to everything. You'll be able to access all these databases. So that's a great place to get started. And yeah, once you're getting started with FME, start applying it to your workspaces and these changes and these tips that we've shown you. So yeah, we're excited to see where things go.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. And to wrap us up today, I will drop the community badge code in the chat here for you to redeem. If you aren't yet part of the community, definitely check it out. It's a great place to network with other FME users and also experts alike. We have a ton of great free resources. The FME Accelerator, I actually just took it last week. It was an awesome free 90-minute workshop. So we have the short link there on the screen. We also have an ebook for you to check out, which is Spatial Data for the Enterprise for Dummies, which we have recently published. And then we have a ton of great upcoming and on-demand webinars available at safe.com/webinars. Save the date and apply to present the Peak of Data integration. Early bird registration is now open as well, so I will share out the link for that if you have yet to register. And we value your feedback. If you have not contributed a Gartner Peer Insight review yet, we really appreciate any feedback there. If you do have any questions, you can email Vivian there. The email's at the bottom. And with that, it does look like we have a few minutes remaining here for some Q&A. So I'll invite everyone to come on stage with their cameras. And if anyone from the Q&A support team would like to join us as well, they're welcome to. And we'll take a look through the questions panel. And it looks like we had a ton of great questions come in, and the team is really on it with answers. So there might be some we want to elaborate on or just go through.
Yeah, lots of questions here, and Steve and Nampreet and Mark have all been busy.
Yeah, one that came in the chat, but not quite in the questions panel, which I thought was pretty useful. I didn't want to dive too much into it in our webinar, just because it gets a little bit more complex. Is having a shared folder for your database connection. So if you do want to, have multiple users using the same database connections, just keep things clean and simple. That's a good way to do it. and we do have information as well on that. So yeah, just wanted to point that one out. See what else we got here.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It was a huge number of great questions. It's hard to pick out any that really stand out, but somewhere in the webinar, Dan was getting a lot of thumbs up with hearts on, so I didn't quite catch which part of the webinar that was. So people, it was something around the SQL or the where clauses on the feature readers. I don't know whether you saw those, Dan, but maybe, so that seemed like something relatively new to people that people were discovering and didn't know that was there or something. But so that was a good reaction to whatever you were showing there.
Yeah, and that's something, once you kind of get your hands on it and you get used to it, it's becomes really fluid and easy to do. I think one thing that Josh pointed out in the chat was that when I was trying to create that view, the SQL creator failed. Well, that was because I already had the view, but you can set up your SQL statements to be kind of redundant, where it can check to see if the view already exists. So in this case, you could use create or alter. Yeah.
And on that topic, actually, there were quite a few questions around that, like in the sense of when you execute the SQL in SQL Executor or SQL Creator, is that really happening on the database, or is FME just sort of fudging something internally? And so that was interesting. Yes, everything done in SQL Executor or SQL Creator with the SQL is done right on the database. So if you create a view, that view is created in the database. If you create a table, you're getting a real table in the database, and so on. So so it was interesting that quite a few people were asking for clarification on that.
There's one good question just came in, guys. It's from Terry Weber. Has anyone told Mark Stokes what a great job he does at SAFE? So.
Some fan mail for you there, Mark.
Wait.
Thanks, Terry. But I think everybody on the experts team does a great job. It's just that you happen to see my face more than some of the others.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth.
everyone you see on the panel here today was involved in the creation of this webinar. So big virtual round of applause for everyone here today. Go ahead, Dan.
I was going to say there's a good question here. I'll pull it up. Can you use a where clause on the Esri file geodatabases? And yes, you can. So when you're reading in your file geodatabases, you can use a where clause on your when you're reading in those feature classes.
Is that limited, Dan, to the Esri reader, the open API? I've noticed the where clauses grayed out for me sometimes in a feature reader.
I've been able to use it on the file geodatabase reader before, the regular one.
Okay.
Are you talking about, is it limited to the full one?
Yeah, sorry, my mistake. I thought that we had two different types of readers there for the file geodatabases. But when using a feature reader, I've noticed in the past that the where clause is sometimes grayed out for me. So I wasn't sure. I actually haven't used the where clause with file geodatabase myself yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With the file geodatabase, it should be the same as the other database readers. Of course, you're working with file based database format, but you can double click on your reader and you'll have the option to specify that where clause.
Cool.
Excellent. And are we good to wrap up at this point, team, or is there anything else we want to address first?
I'm good. I'm just appreciate all the great questions. It's often fairly quiet on the Q&A side, so we're really glad that this webinar that Dan and Matt have put together really resonated and pulled out lots of great questions. If we didn't feel that we really answered the question here, we'll try and follow up afterwards.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think to add to that, if there's anything that comes up after the webinar you got questions on, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will stay online for a couple minutes longer on the back end to see if we can answer any last minute questions that might come in. But with that, huge thank you to Dan and Matt for putting on this webinar here for us this morning, and to our whole Q&A crew team as well. I did see Dale chimed in there a couple times on the back end as well, so thanks, Dale. And big thank you to our whole audience for tuning in today. If you do have a moment to complete our webinar survey, any feedback is much appreciated and helps us continually improve upon the program. So I just dropped that link again there in the chat. And with that, we hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye for now.